Welcome, and consider this. There's an island nation in the Pacific, smaller than the state of California, with almost no oil, little iron ore, and limited arable land, that somehow became the second largest economy on Earth within a single generation after being reduced to ashes. How? How does a civilization that deliberately sealed itself off from the world for 250 years emerge from isolation and, in barely 40 years, defeat two continental empires on the battlefield? How does a culture that produced the world's oldest known pottery, 14,000 years before the Common Era, also produce the bullet train, the microchip, and a global cultural wave that stretches from anime studios in Tokyo to sushi restaurants on every continent? The answer lies in a story so layered, so full of reinvention, contradiction, and sheer determination that it demands to be told from the very beginning. This is the complete story of Japan. Not a summary, not a highlight reel. This is the full journey, from the Jomon hunter-gatherers shaping cord-marked clay vessels beside volcanic coastlines, through the rise of the Yamato emperors who claimed descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, through the elegant world of Heian court poetry and the brutal reality of samurai warfare. We will walk the burning streets of Kyoto during the Onin War, stand on the fog-covered battlefield of Sekigahara, where Tokugawa Ieyasu seized control of a fractured nation, and witness the strange, brilliant isolation of the Edo period, when 1 million people packed into one city and created kabuki theater, woodblock art, and a literacy rate that rivaled anything in Europe. We will feel the shockwave when Commodore Perry's black ships steamed into Edo Bay in 1853, and follow the astonishing transformation that followed, as young samurai dismantled their own feudal world and built a modern industrial state almost overnight. We will confront the darkness of imperial expansion, the horror of the Pacific War, the atomic fire over Hiroshima, and the silence that followed surrender. And then we will witness the resurrection, the factories rising from rubble, the Olympics of 1964, the economic miracle, and the complex, quietly powerful Japan of today. This story matters because Japan has done something almost no other civilization has achieved. It has reinvented itself completely, not once, but multiple times, without losing the thread of its identity. Shinto shrines still stand beside glass towers. Tea ceremonies endure alongside robotics laboratories. The tension between tradition and transformation is not a weakness in Japan. It is the engine of its survival. If you enjoy complete journeys through the rise, struggle, and reinvention of civilizations that shaped our world, please subscribe so you never miss our next exploration. Each week we bring you the full story of a world that changed history. Now let us begin. Let us step back 14,000 years to a forested volcanic archipelago rising from the sea, where the first people of Japan are about to shape clay with their bare hands. The islands emerge from the sea like the spine of some vast submerged creature, thrust upward where 4 tectonic plates grind against one another in slow, ceaseless violence. Volcanic peaks trail smoke into gray skies. Hot springs carve through basalt. Forests of chestnut, walnut, and oak blanket the slopes, and rivers thick with salmon cut their way toward coastlines rich with shellfish. This is the Japanese archipelago, roughly 14,000 years before the Common Era, a chain of more than 6,000 islands stretching from subarctic cold in the north to subtropical warmth in the south, and upon these shores a people already dwell, who will produce something no other human culture on Earth has yet achieved. They make pottery. Long before the farming villages of Mesopotamia, long before the first mud brick walls rise along the Euphrates, the Jomon people press coils of wet clay into vessels and fire them over open flames. The surfaces bear the impression of twisted cord. Jomon, the word means cord marked, and these fragile, flame-licked containers represent the oldest known ceramic tradition in human history. Some fragments date to 16,000 years ago. The people who shape them are not farmers. They are hunters, fishers, and gatherers who harvest the staggering abundance of their volcanic world. At Sanai Maruyama in northern Honshu, a settlement endures for nearly 2,000 years. Hundreds of pit dwellings cluster together, their floors sunk into the earth, roofed with thatch and timber. Massive chestnut pillars support ceremonial structures. Storage pits overflow with chestnuts, walnuts, and lacquered goods. Middens of discarded shells rise in great heaps along the coast, preserving bone fishhooks, antler tools, and the skeletons of deep-sea fish that prove these people venture far from shore in dugout canoes. They carve small clay figurines called dog, wide-eyed, enigmatic forms with exaggerated features, whose purpose remains debated but whose artistry is undeniable. They trade obsidian and jade across hundreds of kilometers. They bury their dead with care, sometimes beneath stone circles aligned to seasonal markers. For more than 10,000 years, this way of life persists, adapting to climate shifts that reshape coastlines and forests. The Jomon world is not static. Regional styles diverge. Pottery grows more elaborate. Flame-rimmed vessels from the Middle Jomon period rise in Baroque spirals of clay, sculptures as much as containers. Population centers shift with changing temperatures. Yet the fundamental pattern holds: a people sustained by the forest, the river, and the sea, without agriculture, without metal, building one of the longest continuous cultural traditions in human history. Then, beginning around 900 years before the Common Era, something changes. From the Korean peninsula and the Asian mainland, new arrivals cross the narrow straits. They carry with them wet rice agriculture, bronze bells called dotaku, iron-edged tools, and weaving techniques unknown to the Jomon world. These are the Yayoi people, and their impact is transformative. Rice paddies spread across the lowlands of northern Kyushu, then steadily eastward along the inland sea coast and into the Kenai Plain. Villages reorganize around irrigated fields. Populations grow. Social hierarchies deepen as control of water and surplus grain concentrates power. Warfare increases. Skeletal remains from Yayoi sites show wounds inflicted by metal weapons. The Jomon world does not vanish overnight. In the north and in remote mountain regions, older ways persist for centuries, and genetic evidence confirms extensive intermingling between Jomon and Yayoi populations. The modern Japanese people carry the inheritance of both. But the trajectory is set. By 300 years before the Common Era, wet rice farming dominates Western Japan. Bronze and iron reshape tool-making and ritual, and the first recognizable precursors of political organization begin to coalesce. Somewhere in this convergence of forager and farmer, of volcanic island and continental influence, of cord-marked clay and flooded paddy, a civilization is taking its first breath. That first breath quickens. Across the centuries following 300 years before the Common Era, the scattered rice-growing communities of Western Japan begin to consolidate into something larger, something with hierarchy, ambition, and memory. Settlements grow into fortified villages, villages into regional chieftaincies, and chieftaincies into small kingdoms that Chinese chroniclers will eventually notice. The Weizhi, a 3rd century Chinese text, describes the land of Wa, a fragmented archipelago of more than 30 polities, one of them ruled by a shamaness queen named Himiko, who governs through spiritual authority and sends tribute envoys to the Wei court. Her realm, called Yamatai, remains one of Japanese history's most debated mysteries, its exact location still uncertain. But the pattern she represents is clear. Political power in these islands is already entwined with sacred legitimacy. By the middle of the 3rd century, something monumental begins to reshape the Kenai Plain around modern-day Osaka and Nara. Enormous keyhole-shaped burial mounds, kofun, rise from the landscape, some stretching more than 400 meters in length, surrounded by moats and studded with clay haniwa figures depicting warriors, horses, houses, and priestesses. The largest, Daisen Kofun near Sakai, attributed to Emperor Nintoku, rivals the Egyptian pyramids in sheer footprint. These tombs announce the arrival of a ruling elite with the labor resources to reshape the earth itself. The clan behind them is the Yamato, and over the 4th and 5th centuries, the Yamato court extends its influence across much of Honshu, Shikoku, and northern Kyushu, binding regional chiefs through marriage alliances, ritual authority, and military pressure. The Yamato rulers anchor their legitimacy in mythology. Their genealogies trace an unbroken line to Amaterasu, the sun goddess, whose grandson descends to earth and whose great-grandson, Jinmu, supposedly founds the imperial dynasty in 660 before the Common Era. This narrative, codified centuries later, serves a political purpose. The emperor rules not merely by conquest, but by divine right, a descendant of heaven governing the Middle Land. Continental influence accelerates. Korean scribes bring Chinese writing to the Yamato court in the 5th century. In 552, emissaries from the Korean kingdom of Baekje present a gilded bronze Buddha and sutras to the Japanese sovereign, igniting a fierce debate between clans, favoring the new faith and those defending native kami worship. Buddhism wins powerful patrons. By the late 6th century, Prince Shotoku, regent to Empress Suiko, embraces Buddhist philosophy and Confucian governance. His 17-article constitution of 604 is not a legal code, but a moral exhortation. Harmony is to be valued, Buddhist teachings revered, imperial commands obeyed. He commissions Horyuji, the world's oldest surviving wooden temple complex, its pagoda and golden hall still standing near Nara. The real structural revolution comes in 645 with the Taika reforms. A palace coup led by Prince Naka no Oo and Nakatomi no Kamatari overthrows the powerful Soga clan and launches a sweeping reorganization modeled on Tang China. All land is declared the property of the emperor. Provincial governors replace hereditary chieftains. A census and tax system are imposed. The reforms unfold unevenly over decades, meeting resistance and requiring revision, but their direction is unmistakable. Japan is building a centralized bureaucratic state with the emperor at its apex. Successive legal codes, the Omi Code, the Asuka Kiyomihara Code, and finally the Taiho Code of 701 formalize this structure. A permanent capital rises at Fujiwara-kyo, laid out on a Chinese grid plan, before the court decides on an even grander site. In 710, the imperial government relocates to Nara, a city of broad avenues, Buddhist monasteries, and government ministries staffed by officials writing on wooden tablets in Chinese characters. The archipelago of scattered chieftains and shamaness queens has become a literate, Buddhist-influenced, imperially governed state, one that claims its sovereign descends from the sun itself. The broad avenues of Nara stretch outward in a precise grid, 8 great boulevards running north to south, crossed by 9 running east to west, the entire plan borrowed from the Tang capital of Chang'an, yet scaled to fit a narrower valley, ringed by forested hills. At the city's northern edge rises the imperial palace compound, its vermilion pillars and green-tiled roofs visible from every quarter. Government ministries line the central avenue, their officials arriving each morning in ox-drawn carriages, carrying wooden tablets inscribed with population registers, tax assessments, and provincial reports. This is Heijō-kyo, and for 84 years it serves as the beating heart of the Japanese state. Within 2 years of the capital's founding, a court scholar named O no Yasumaro completes the Kojiki, the record of ancient matters, setting down in writing the mythological cycle stretching from the creation of the islands to the age of the early emperors. 8 years later, in 720, the more expansive Nihon Shoki follows, a chronicle modeled on Chinese dynastic histories but insisting on an unbroken imperial lineage reaching back to the divine. Together, these texts give the young state something no legal code can provide, a shared origin story, a narrative spine binding the archipelago's disparate clans into a single people descended from the gods. Buddhism, already embraced by the court, now transforms the physical landscape. Monasteries multiply across the capital and its surrounding provinces. 6 major philosophical schools flourish, each studying different sutras imported from the continent, their monks debating doctrine in halls fragrant with sandalwood incense. The state sponsors temple construction not merely from piety, but from political calculation. Buddhist ritual is believed to protect the nation itself. Then catastrophe strikes. Between 735 and 737, a devastating smallpox epidemic sweeps the archipelago, killing perhaps 1/3 of the population. Entire villages empty. 4 brothers of the powerful Fujiwara clan perish within months of one another, throwing the government into disarray. Emperor Shomu, shaken to his core, turns to Buddhism with desperate intensity. In 743, he issues an imperial edict, ordering the construction of a colossal bronze statue of the cosmic Buddha Vairocana, Rushanabutsu, at a new temple called Todai-ji in the eastern hills of Nara. The project consumes the resources of the entire nation. Copper is mined from provincial deposits, gold discovered for the first time in the far northeast. Thousands of laborers and craftsmen work for years. When the great Buddha is finally dedicated in 752, it stands nearly 15 meters tall inside the largest wooden building on Earth. Foreign monks from China, India, and Central Asia attend the ceremony. The eye-opening ritual, in which a brush dipped in ink symbolically grants the statue site, is performed by an Indian monk named Bodhisena. Nara, in that moment, stands at the eastern terminus of a Buddhist world stretching from the Ganges to the Pacific. Yet the very power of the monasteries becomes a problem. Temple complexes accumulate tax-exempt estates. monks intervene in court politics. The monk Dokyo, favored by the formidable Empress Koken, who reigns twice under different names, rises to extraordinary influence, nearly claiming the throne itself in the 760s. The court recoils. After Koken's death, officials resolve that such entanglement must never recur. The Shozoin storehouse, sealed within Todaiji's compound, preserves the personal belongings of Emperor Shomu after his death in 756, Persian glass vessels, Chinese silk textiles, Central Asian musical instruments, medicines, mirrors, and game boards. This single collection reveals Nara as a cosmopolitan node connected by trade and diplomacy to the wider Asian world. But the decision has already been forming. The capital must move, away from the political gravity of Nara's monasteries, away from their wealth and ambition. In 784, Emperor Kanmu relocates the court to Nagaoka-kyo, and when that site proves troubled by assassination and ill fortune, he moves again. In 794, the imperial government settles at a new city called Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. It will be known centuries later simply as Kyoto. Behind it, Nara's great temples endure in silence, their bronze Buddha gazing forward with half-closed eyes, monuments to an age when a young state reached for the light of the cosmos and, in doing so, discovered the weight of its own ambitions. Heian-kyo rises from a broad basin cradled between forested mountains, its streets laid in the familiar Chinese grid. Yet something here already feels different. The new capital breathes with a quieter confidence than Nara ever possessed. No great monasteries crowd the imperial precinct. Emperor Kanmu has deliberately excluded them, and the court settles into its fresh surroundings with a sense of liberation, free to cultivate a civilization on its own terms. At the heart of this world stands the Dairi, the imperial residential compound within the greater palace enclosure. Cypress bark roofs slope gracefully over halls connected by covered corridors. Sliding screens painted with seasonal landscapes divide interior spaces where courtiers move in rustling layers of silk. The aesthetic ideal is miyabi, refined elegance, and it governs everything from the color combinations of a noblewoman's 12-layered junihito robes to the angle at which a poem is brushed onto mulberry paper. Scent matters as much as sight. Courtiers blend their own incense from imported aloes wood and clove, and the fragrance trailing from a passing sleeve can determine a reputation. The Fujiwara clan masters this world with extraordinary patience. Through strategic marriages to the imperial house across generations, they secure the position of regent, Sessho for child emperors, Kampaku for adults, until the distinction between Fujiwara council and imperial will nearly vanishes. By the early 11th century, Fujiwara no Michinaga presides over a court where 3 of his daughters have married emperors and his grandsons sit upon the throne. He reportedly composes a poem declaring that the full moon lacks nothing, just as his own glory lacks nothing. It is the apex of aristocratic power, achieved not through armies, but through bloodlines, ceremony, and the careful choreography of influence. Yet the Fujiwara Regency also nurtures one of history's great literary flowerings. The adaptation of Chinese characters into the simplified kana syllabaries, hiragana and katakana, liberates Japanese expression from the constraints of classical Chinese. Court women, educated but excluded from the male domain of Chinese scholarship, seize this new script. Around the year 1000, Lady Murasaki Shikibu, a lady-in-waiting to Empress Shoshi, composes the tale of Genji, a vast narrative exploring the emotional interior of an imperial prince and the world of longing, beauty, and impermanence surrounding him. Her contemporary Sei Shonagon produces the Pillow Book, a sharp and witty catalogue of court observations. These works establish Japanese prose literature as a tradition of psychological depth and aesthetic precision unmatched anywhere in the contemporary world. Beyond the capital's boundaries, however, a different Japan is forming. Provincial estates called shuen, granted to aristocrats, and temples as tax-exempt holdings steadily erode central revenue. Local managers hire armed men to protect these lands. Over decades, these armed retainers coalesce into warrior clans bound by loyalty, horsemanship, and skill with the bow. Two clans rise above the rest, the Taira, dominant along the inland sea coast, and the Minamoto, powerful in the eastern provinces. The court, increasingly unable to enforce order through its own bureaucracy, begins calling upon these warriors to suppress rebellions and pirates. The consequences arrive swiftly. In 1156, the Hogan disturbance draws both Taira and Minamoto fighters into a succession dispute within the imperial family itself. 3 years later, the Heiji disturbance pits the two clans directly against each other. Taira no Kiyomori emerges victorious and installs himself at the summit of court politics, placing his infant grandson on the throne. For 2 decades, the Taira govern through the same marriage politics the Fujiwara once perfected, but they lack the generations of legitimacy that had cushioned Fujiwara dominance. Resentment builds among rival courtiers and among the Minamoto survivors scattered across the eastern plains. The silk screens still glow in Kyoto's candlelight. Incense still drifts through latticed windows. But in the provinces, young men practice mounted archery across open fields, and the language of power is shifting from poetry to the sword. The world of the Shining Prince has not ended, but its foundations tremble beneath the weight of forces it can no longer contain. In the spring of 1180, a prince of the blood named Mochihito issues a call to arms against the Taira, and the eastern provinces answer. Minamoto no Yoritomo, exiled for 2 decades among the rough warriors of the Kanto plain, raises his banner in Izu. His younger brother Yoshitsune, barely past boyhood, proves a military genius of terrifying instinct. The Genpei War engulfs the archipelago for 5 years, and it is fought not in palace corridors, but across rain-soaked mountain passes, river crossings, and coastal straits where armored horsemen charge through surf. Yoshitsune's campaigns become legend. At Ichi no Tani in 1184, his cavalry descends a cliff face the Taira believe impassable. At Yashima, he attacks a fortified coastal camp with so few men that the Taira mistake his force for a vanguard and flee to their ships. Then, in the spring of 1185, the war reaches its climax in the narrow strait of Shimonoseki. At Dan no Ura, the Taira fleet is crushed. The child emperor Antoku, barely 6 years old, is carried into the sea by his grandmother. The sacred imperial sword sinks with them and is never recovered. An entire ruling order vanishes beneath the waves. Yoritomo does not march into Kyoto to claim the throne. Instead, he establishes his headquarters at Kamakura, a small coastal settlement backed by forested hills on 3 sides, and the sea on the 4th, far from the intrigues of the imperial court. In 1185, he receives from the emperor the title of Supreme Military Commander, and by 1192, the position of shogun formalizes his authority. The emperor remains in Kyoto, performing rituals and granting titles, but real power now resides with warriors. Japan has entered an age of dual government that will persist for nearly 7 centuries. The Kamakura system rests on bonds of loyalty between lord and vassal. Land stewards and military governors appointed by the shogunate administer provinces. Samurai receive estates in exchange for service, and a new legal code, the Joi Formulary of 1232, codifies warrior law with a directness that contrasts sharply with the elaborate court precedents of Kyoto. Justice becomes swifter, harsher, and rooted in martial values of discipline and obligation. Zen Buddhism arrives from Song China and finds its most receptive audience among these warriors. The practice demands no elaborate scripture, only rigorous meditation and direct confrontation with the nature of mind. Monasteries rise in Kamakura's valleys. The great Buddha, cast in bronze in 1252, sits in open air after a tsunami sweeps away its wooden hall, and its serene expression becomes an enduring image of this age. Yet the greatest test comes from beyond the sea. In 1274, Kublai Khan dispatches a fleet of 900 vessels carrying nearly 40,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers to Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu. The samurai, accustomed to individual combat, face massed infantry tactics and explosive ceramic shells for the first time. A fierce storm scatters the invasion fleet before it can consolidate. The shogunate, under the iron-willed regent Hojo Tokimune, orders the construction of a stone defensive wall stretching 20 kilometers along the bay. When the Mongols return in 1281 with an armada of over 4,000 ships and perhaps 140,000 men, the wall holds long enough for a massive typhoon to annihilate the fleet. Later generations call these storms kamikaze, the divine wind. Victory, however, bankrupts the regime. There are no conquered lands to distribute as reward, and indebted samurai grow restless. The Hojo regents tighten control, but lose the loyalty that sustains military rule. In 1333, Emperor Go-Daigo rallies disaffected warriors, and the general Ashikaga Takauji, sent to crush the rebellion, instead turns against Kamakura. The shogunate collapses with startling speed. The last Hojo regent dies by his own hand as Kamakura burns. The age of the mounted archer and the coastal fortress gives way to new uncertainties. The warrior class has proven it can govern, but it has also proven it can devour itself. In the smoldering ruins of Kamakura, the question is no longer whether samurai will rule Japan, but which samurai, and under what terms, and at what cost. Ashikaga Takauji claims the shogunate in 1336, but the victory is incomplete. Emperor Go-Daigo refuses to yield, fleeing south to Yoshino with the imperial regalia and establishing a rival court that will contest legitimacy for nearly 6 decades. 2 emperors, 2 courts, 2 competing claims to divine authority. The northern and southern courts split Japan's political soul, even as Takauji installs his government not in distant Kamakura, but in Kyoto itself, in the Muromachi district, placing military power directly beside the imperial throne. The early Ashikaga shoguns governed through negotiation more than command. Regional military governors, the shugo, control vast territories and command private armies that dwarf the shogun's own forces. Power depends on balancing these lords against one another, rewarding loyalty with provincial appointments, punishing defiance through coalition. It is governance by persuasion, and it is fragile. Yet from this fragility emerges astonishing cultural refinement. The third shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, reunifies the two imperial courts in 1392 and transforms Kyoto into a stage for aristocratic splendor. His retirement villa at Kitayama, crowned by the Golden Pavilion, Kinkakuji, rises 3 stories above a mirror-still pond, its upper floors sheathed in gold leaf that catches the afternoon light and scatters it across the water. The building itself embodies Yoshimitsu's ambition. The ground floor in the Shinden style of the old court nobility, the second in the manner of warrior residences, the third a Zen chapel gilded like a Buddhist reliquary. 3 worlds fused into one structure, presided over by a man who holds no formal imperial title, yet receives envoys from the Ming Emperor as the King of Japan. Under Yoshimitsu's patronage, the playwright and theorist Zeami Motokyo elevates No theater from popular entertainment into a refined dramatic art. Masked performers move across bare cedar stages with glacial precision, their gestures distilling grief, longing, and supernatural encounter into movements so controlled that a single tilt of the head carries the weight of an entire narrative. Ink-wash painting flourishes under Zen-trained monks like Josetsu and later Sesshu Toyo, who reduce landscapes to essential strokes of black ink on white paper, finding vastness in emptiness. The tea ceremony begins its slow evolution from casual stimulant drinking into a disciplined aesthetic practice rooted in wabi, the beauty of austere simplicity. Trade with Ming China through the tally system brings copper coins, silk, porcelain, and Buddhist texts flowing into Japanese ports, particularly Hakata and Sakai. Japanese exports of sulfur, swords, folding fans, and lacquerware generate wealth that enriches both the shogunate and the merchant class. Zen monasteries serve as brokers and translators, their monks literate in Chinese, their networks spanning the sea. But the cultural brilliance masks deepening structural weakness. After Yoshimitsu's death in 1408, successive shoguns prove less capable of managing the Shugo lords. Provincial disputes escalate. Peasant uprisings demanding debt cancellation erupt with increasing frequency across the 1430s and 40s. The 6th shogun, Yoshinori, attempts to reassert central authority through assassination and intimidation, but is himself murdered by a disgruntled vassal in 1441. The breaking point arrives with a succession dispute within the Ashikaga house itself. 2 rival candidates for the next shogunate attract the support of the 2 most powerful Shugo families, the Hosokawa and the Yamana. In 1467, their armies converge on Kyoto. The Onin War begins not as a grand strategic campaign, but as street-by-street urban combat that reduces the ancient capital to ash. Temples burn, aristocratic mansions collapse. Neighborhoods that had stood for centuries vanish in firestorms that rage unchecked through wooden districts. The fighting drags on for 10 years, but the real destruction is political. Central authority disintegrates. Shugo lords abandon Kyoto to defend their home provinces, and in their absence, subordinates seize power from below. By the time the last embers cool, the Ashikaga shogunate survives in name only, a hollow institution presiding over nothing. The Golden Pavilion still stands beside its pond, but the world that built it has shattered into fragments, and from those fragments a century of unrelenting war is about to begin. The fragments become a world unto themselves. After 1467, Japan does not simply endure civil war. It dissolves into a permanent condition of armed competition, where every boundary is provisional and every alliance temporary. The old provincial governors, the shugo, lose their grip one by one, overthrown by their own deputies, by local strongmen, by ambitious monks, by anyone with enough swords and enough will. The Japanese themselves will name this phenomenon Gekokujo, the low overthrowing the high, and it becomes the defining principle of an entire century. From this chaos rises a new figure, the daimyo, the domain lord who rules not by imperial appointment but by military fact. These warlords govern territories as independent states, collecting taxes, administering justice, conscripting armies, and building castles. The castles themselves transform the landscape. Where earlier fortifications were simple wooden stockades on hilltops, the Sengoku daimyo construct elaborate complexes with massive stone foundations, concentric baileys, and towering keeps visible for miles. These structures serve as administrative centers, symbols of power, and last resort defenses. Castle towns grow around their walls, markets, workshops, barracks, temples, creating new urban centers that owe nothing to Kyoto. War is constant but not formless. Rival daimyo wage campaigns governed by shifting alliances, marriage pacts, hostage exchanges, and betrayals so frequent they become expected. In the eastern provinces, Takeda Shingen of Kai and Uesugi Kenshin of Echigo fight a legendary series of engagements at Kawanakajima through the 1550s, their rivalry becoming the age's most celebrated military contest. In the west, the Mori clan expands across multiple provinces. In Kyushu, the Shimazu and Otomo contest dominance. Beneath the warlords, common soldiers, many of them farmers pressed into seasonal campaigns, die in numbers no chronicle bothers to count. Then, in 1543, a Chinese junk carrying Portuguese traders runs aground on the island of Tanegashima, off Kyushu's southern coast. The Portuguese carry matchlock firearms, and within months local smiths are replicating them. The arquebus spreads across Japan with astonishing speed. Daimyo who grasp its potential begin training massed ranks of gunners, and within a generation the weapon reshapes battlefield tactics entirely. Close behind the merchants come Jesuit missionaries. Francis Xavier lands at Kagoshima in 1549, and his mission finds unexpected success. Several Kyushu daimyo convert to Christianity, some from genuine conviction, others to secure preferential access to Portuguese trade in silk, saltpeter, and firearms. Small wooden churches rise in harbor towns, and by the 1560s tens of thousands of Japanese have been baptized. Yet neither guns nor gospels alone can reunify the nation. That task falls to individual ambition meeting strategic genius. In the province of Owari, a minor daimyo's heir named Oda Nobunaga, dismissed by rivals as a fool for his eccentric behavior, methodically consolidates his home domain through the 1550s. In June of 1560, a vastly larger army under Imagawa Yoshimoto marches through Owari toward Kyoto. Nobunaga, outnumbered perhaps 10-1, launches a surprise attack during a rainstorm at the narrow gorge of Okehazama. Yoshimoto is killed. The victory is improbable, decisive, and transformative. Overnight, Nobunaga becomes a figure of national consequence, and the path toward reunification cracks open. By 1560, Japan has endured nearly a century of fragmentation. Its political map is unrecognizable from the orderly provincial system of earlier centuries. Hundreds of autonomous domains wage perpetual war. Foreign technology and foreign faith have arrived on its shores. Villages fortify themselves with ditches and bamboo palisades. Farmers carry weapons. Monks command armies. The old social order has been shattered so thoroughly that a new one can only be forged by force. And in Owari, a young warlord who has just destroyed an army 10 times his size turns his gaze toward the capital, toward the hollow shogunate, toward the fractured nation waiting to be seized. Nobunaga moves with a speed that stuns his rivals. Within a decade of Okehazama, he has crushed the Saito clan of Mino, seized their castle at Inabayama, and renamed it Gifu, a deliberate echo of the Chinese mountain from which the Zhou dynasty launched its conquest. In 1568, he marches into Kyoto escorting Ashikaga Yoshiaki, the last pretender to the shogunal title, installing him as a puppet before discarding him entirely 5 years later. The old shogunate, hollow for a century, finally ceases to exist. What makes Nobunaga revolutionary is not merely his ambition, but his methods. At Nagashino in 1575, he deploys 3,000 arquebusiers behind wooden palisades, rotating their volleys in disciplined sequence to annihilate the legendary Takeda cavalry. It is the first large-scale tactical use of firearms in Japanese warfare, and it renders the mounted charge obsolete in a single afternoon. He builds Azuchi Castle on the shores of Lake Biwa, not a mountain fortress, but a towering 7-story keep with gilded walls and painted interiors, a declaration that power now resides not in hidden strongholds, but in visible, overwhelming splendor. He breaks the military power of the great Buddhist monasteries, burning the Enryakuji complex on Mount Hiei to the ground in 1571. He opens free markets, abolishes toll barriers on roads, and encourages commerce with a ruthlessness that terrifies the old order. Then, on a June morning in 1582, his own general Akechi Mitsuhide surrounds the temple of Honnoji in Kyoto. Nobunaga, with only a handful of attendants, perishes in the flames. The unifier who remade warfare, shattered religious armies, and envisioned a centralized state dies before completing his work. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of no noble birth who rose from foot soldier to Nobunaga's most trusted commander, avenges his lord within 11 days, destroying Akechi at the Battle of Yamazaki. Over the next 8 years, Hideyoshi completes what Nobunaga began. He subdues Shikoku, conquers Kyushu, and compels the warrior clans of the north to submit. By 1590, all of Japan acknowledges his authority. His sword hunt of 1588 confiscates weapons from peasants, severing the link between farming and fighting that the Sengoku era had forged. His land surveys fix tax obligations to measured rice yields, binding cultivators to their fields. A new social order crystallizes: samurai above, farmers below, merchants and artisans in their designated places. Osaka Castle, with its massive stone walls and golden ornaments, becomes the physical expression of his power. Yet Hideyoshi overreaches. In 1592, he launches an invasion of Korea with over 150,000 troops, aiming ultimately at Ming China. Japanese forces seize Seoul and Pyongyang with shocking speed, but Korean naval commander Yi Sun-sin devastates supply lines with his armored turtle ships, and Ming reinforcements push the invaders back. A second invasion in 1597 ends in bitter stalemate. Hideyoshi dies in 1598, leaving a 5-year-old heir and a council of regents already fracturing with rivalry. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the most patient of the three unifiers, has spent decades accumulating strength in the eastern Kanto plain. He commands the largest domain in Japan and has outlived every serious competitor. When the region split into hostile factions, Ieyasu draws his enemies into open battle. On the morning of October 21st, 1600, approximately 160,000 warriors face each other across the narrow valley of Sekigahara, shrouded in autumn fog. The outcome hinges on betrayal. Several Western commanders switch sides or refuse to engage, and by afternoon, Ieyasu's Eastern Army has won the most decisive battle in Japanese history. 3 years later, in 1603, the imperial court grants Ieyasu the title of shogun. He establishes his capital at Edo, a modest castle town that will grow into the greatest city in the world. The Tokugawa Shogunate begins, not with a single dramatic stroke, but with the quiet administrative genius of a man who understood that lasting power requires not just victory, but structure. The age of warring states is over. The age of enforced peace is about to begin. The structure reveals itself slowly, like ink spreading through water. Ieyasu does not simply rule, he engineers a political architecture designed to make rebellion impossible. Every daimyo in Japan is classified according to loyalty. The Fudai, hereditary allies who stood with the Tokugawa before Sekigahara, receive strategic domains near Edo and key highways. The Tozama, those who submitted only after the battle, are pushed to distant provinces, Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, Hizen, far from the corridors of power, yet watched with unblinking suspicion. The instrument of control is elegant and ruthless. The Sankin Kodai system, formalized under the third shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu in 1635, compels every daimyo to maintain a residence in Edo and to spend alternate years there in attendance upon the shogun. Their wives and heirs remain in the capital permanently, hostages in all but name. The financial burden is staggering. Vast processions of samurai retainers, porters, and servants travel the 5 great highways, particularly the Tokaido linking Kyoto to Edo, consuming fortunes on lodging, ceremony, and display. No domain can accumulate the surplus wealth needed to fund insurrection. Edo Castle rises at the center of this web, its concentric moats and white-plastered walls enclosing the largest fortress complex in the world. Around it, the city grows with astonishing speed. Samurai estates in the inner wards, merchant quarters, and artisan blocks spreading outward along canals and wooden bridges. Yet the shogunate perceives a threat more insidious than any rival lord. Christianity, planted by Jesuit and Franciscan missionaries since the 1540s, has taken root among tens of thousands of converts in Kyushu and beyond. Ieyasu's successors see in this foreign faith a loyalty that transcends the earthly order, believers who answer to Rome rather than Edo. The persecutions intensify under Iemitsu. Missionaries are hunted, tortured, and executed. Japanese Christians are forced to trample on bronze images of Christ and the Virgin, the Fumi, to prove apostasy. Those who refuse face crucifixion, immersion in boiling hot springs, or suspension upside down over pits. In 1637, desperation erupts. Tens of thousands of impoverished peasants and masterless samurai, many of them Christian, rise in rebellion on the Shimabara Peninsula and the nearby Amakusa Islands. They fortify the ruined Hara Castle and hold out for months against a shogunal army of over 120,000 troops. When the castle falls in April 1638, virtually every defender is slaughtered. men, women, and children, perhaps 37,000 dead. It is the bloodiest single event of the Tokugawa era, and it seals the shogunate's resolve. Between 1633 and 1639, a series of edicts progressively closes Japan to the outside world. Japanese subjects are forbidden to travel abroad on pain of death. Those already overseas are barred from returning. The construction of ocean-going vessels is prohibited. The Portuguese, suspected of harboring missionary ambitions, are expelled entirely in 1639. When a Portuguese embassy from Macau arrives in 1640 to negotiate, its envoys are executed. What remains is a carefully controlled aperture. The Dutch, who have demonstrated willingness to trade without proselytizing, are confined to Dejima, a tiny fan-shaped artificial island in Nagasaki harbor, barely 240 paces long. Chinese merchants operate in a designated quarter nearby. Korean diplomats visit periodically through the Tsushima domain. The Ryukyu Kingdom maintains tributary relations through Satsuma. These four narrow channels constitute Japan's entire formal contact with the outside world. Behind these walls, something unexpected takes shape. Peace, enforced and absolute, settles across the archipelago for the first time in centuries. Roads improve. Rice production expands. Castle towns evolve into commercial centers. A national economy begins to cohere, linked by coastal shipping routes and overland highways. Literacy spreads through temple schools. By the end of the 17th century, Edo has surpassed 1 million inhabitants, rivaling London and Beijing. The Sengoku fortress is sealed, and within its silence, an extraordinary civilization is quietly being born. That civilization announces itself in color, noise, and spectacle. By 1700, Edo is not merely large, it is one of the most densely populated, commercially vibrant, and culturally productive cities on Earth. More than 1 million souls crowd its wooden neighborhoods, connected by a lattice of canals, bridges, and fire breaks that give the metropolis its distinctive rhythm. Samurai estates occupy the high ground near the castle. Below them, in the Shitamachi lowlands along the Sumida River, merchants, artisans, fishmongers, and entertainers press together in narrow wooden townhouses, their lives governed less by Confucian hierarchy than by the pulse of commerce and pleasure. The Genroku era, spanning roughly 1688 to 1704, had already ignited this cultural explosion. Ihara Saikaku's novels chronicled the erotic and financial adventures of the merchant class with unprecedented frankness. Matsuo Basho had wandered the northern provinces composing haiku that distilled entire landscapes into 17 syllables. Chikamatsu Monsemon wrote puppet plays for the Bunraku stage in Osaka that explored love suicides and merchant honor with a psychological depth rivaling anything in European theater. These were not court artists serving aristocratic patrons. They were urban professionals creating for a paying public hungry for entertainment and self-reflection. Kabuki theater becomes the supreme popular art. Actors perform on stages equipped with revolving platforms and trapdoor mechanisms that astonish audiences. The onagata, male actors specializing in female roles, achieve celebrity status that transcends class boundaries. Their likenesses circulate through ukiyo-e woodblock prints, the mass medium of the age. Hishikawa Moronobu had pioneered the single-sheet print in the late 17th century. Now workshops across Edo produce thousands of images depicting actors, courtesans, landscapes, and seasonal festivals, sold for the price of a bowl of noodles. Art, for the first time in Japanese history, belongs to everyone. The official hierarchy remains rigid on paper. Samurai stand at the apex, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants at the bottom. Yet economic reality inverts this order. Rice stipends lose value as the money economy expands. Samurai borrow from the very merchants they officially despise. In Osaka, the Dojima Rice Exchange operates what historians recognize as the world's first organized futures market, with traders speculating on harvests months away. Wealth flows upward from commerce, not downward from land. The Yoshiwara licensed pleasure quarter in Edo functions as a self-contained world of regulated entertainment, tea houses, courtesans ranked in elaborate hierarchies, poetry competitions, and fashion displays that set trends across the city. It is exploitative and glamorous in equal measure, a place where social rules bend but never fully break. By the 1720s, fiscal crisis forces intervention. Shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune launches the Kyoho reforms, attempting to restore samurai finances through austerity, currency adjustments, and encouragement of new rice cultivation. He relaxes the ban on foreign books, permitting the import of non-religious Western texts through Nagasaki, a small opening that will have enormous consequences in the next century. The reforms stabilize the regime temporarily, but cannot reverse the fundamental shift of economic power toward the merchant class. Fires remain the great equalizer. The catastrophic Meireki blaze of 1657 had already demonstrated Edo's vulnerability, destroying half the city and killing perhaps 100,000 people. Throughout the 18th century, fires sweep through wooden neighborhoods with terrifying regularity, and each rebuilding reinforces the city's impermanent, resilient character. Edo learns to live with destruction as a seasonal fact. Beneath the spectacle, a quieter transformation unfolds. Temple schools called terrakoya spread literacy to commoners' children. Publishing houses produce encyclopedias, travel guides, agricultural manuals, and popular fiction in quantities that make Japan one of the most literate societies on the planet. A national culture coheres, shared references, shared entertainments, shared roads traveled by pilgrims heading to the great shrine at Ise. The floating world, ukiyo, originally a Buddhist term for the sorrowful transience of existence, has been repurposed. It now means something almost opposite, the shimmering, pleasurable, evanescent present, enjoyed precisely because it will not last. This is the philosophy of an entire urban civilization living inside walls it did not choose, finding within confinement a freedom of expression that no one had planned and no authority can fully contain. But the walls are thinning. As the 19th century opens, the Tokugawa order that once seemed eternal begins to reveal fractures so deep that no lacquer of tradition can conceal them. The pressures come from within and without, and they arrive almost simultaneously. The land itself turns hostile. The Tenmei famine of the 1780s has already scarred collective memory, but the Tenpo famine that strikes between 1833 and 1837 is worse in its geographic reach. Cold summers destroy rice harvests across the northeast. Villages that once sent surplus grain to Edo now cannot feed their own. Peasants strip bark from trees, boil straw, and die along roadsides in numbers that local officials cannot count and Edo authorities prefer not to acknowledge. In Osaka, a former city magistrate's officer named Oshio Heihachiro watches rice merchants hoard grain while commoners starve. In 1837, he leads an armed uprising, setting fire to a quarter of the city before the shogunate crushes the revolt within a day. Oshio dies, but the symbolism endures. A Confucian scholar, a man of the system, driven to rebellion by the system's own failures. Domain finances crumble in parallel. Samurai stipends, fixed in rice, lose value as the monetized economy expands. Many warriors, nominally the ruling class, live in genteel poverty, pawning swords and borrowing from the merchants they officially despise. The shogunate's senior counselor, Mizuno Tadakuni, launches the Tenpo reforms between 1841 and 1843, attempting to suppress luxury, force peasants back to the land, and dissolve merchant monopolies. The reforms antagonize nearly every constituency and collapse within 2 years, leaving the regime weaker than before. Meanwhile, a quiet revolution unfolds in candlelit studies. Through the single aperture of Dejima, Rangaku scholars absorb Western anatomy, astronomy, chemistry, and military science. Sugita Genpaku's translation of a Dutch anatomy text decades earlier has spawned an entire intellectual tradition. By the 1830s, scholars in Edo, Osaka, and provincial castle towns dissect Western books on steam power, vaccination, and coastal gunnery. They understand with increasing clarity that the outside world has changed in ways the Sengoku framework cannot accommodate. That outside world presses closer every year. Russian ships appear off Hokkaido and the Kurils, demanding trade. British vessels probe the Ryukyu Islands and Nagasaki. In 1837, the American merchant ship Morrison approaches Edo Bay, carrying shipwrecked Japanese sailors, offering their return as a gesture of goodwill. Coastal batteries fire on the vessel, driving it away under the shogunate's standing order to repel all foreign ships. Rangaku scholars who criticize this response are arrested. Then comes the news that reshapes every strategic calculation. In 1842, word reaches Japan that Qing China, the great continental civilization, the ancient source of so much that Japan reveres, has been defeated and humiliated by British warships in the Opium War. The Treaty of Nanking forces open Chinese ports, cedes Hong Kong, and imposes indemnities. Japanese officials study these reports with cold dread. If China, with its vast armies and population, cannot resist Western naval power, what chance does Japan have behind its wooden walls and bronze cannon? The shogunate quietly relaxes its order to fire on foreign ships, replacing it with instructions to provide fuel and water before sending vessels away. Coastal domains begin casting Western-style cannon and drilling troops in unfamiliar formations. But these measures are piecemeal, uncoordinated, and desperately insufficient against the industrial navies now roaming the Pacific. The fortress still stands in 1853, its gates still closed, its rituals still observed. But those who listen carefully can hear the timbers groaning. Foreign whaling fleets crowd the northern Pacific, needing coal and provisions. American commercial ambitions fix upon Japan as a gateway to Asian markets. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a naval squadron is being assembled, its mission authorized at the highest levels of the United States government, its destination the locked harbors of a nation that has kept the world at bay for over 2 centuries. The cracks have become fissures, and through them the future is already visible. They arrive on the 8th of July, 1853. 4 vessels, 2 of them steam-powered, trailing columns of black smoke across the still waters of Uraga Channel. The fishermen who witness the approach have no framework for what they are seeing. These are not the wooden sailing ships that occasionally drift near Japanese shores. The paddle frigates move against the wind, against the current, as if propelled by some infernal mechanism. Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy carries a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding the opening of Japanese ports to American trade, the provision of coal and supplies for trans-Pacific shipping, and the humane treatment of shipwrecked sailors. Perry refuses all Japanese requests to redirect his squadron to Nagasaki, the only port where foreign contact is permitted. He delivers the letter with deliberate ceremony and departs, promising to return the following year with a larger fleet for an answer. The shogunate is paralyzed. For the first time in Tokugawa history, the government in Edo circulates the foreign demand among the daimyo lords, soliciting opinions, an extraordinary admission of uncertainty from a regime built on unchallenged authority. When Perry returns in February of 1854 with 9 warships, the calculus is brutally simple. Japan possesses no navy capable of contesting these vessels, no coastal artillery sufficient to repel them. On the 31st of March, the Convention of Kanagawa opens 2 ports and grants basic provisions to American ships. It is modest in scope, but shattering in principle. The fortress of Sengoku has been breached. What follows accelerates beyond anyone's control. Townsend Harris, the first American consul, negotiates the far more consequential Treaty of Amity and Commerce in 1858, imposing extraterritorial rights for foreign nationals, fixed low tariffs that Japan cannot adjust, and the opening of additional ports. Chief Counselor E. Naosuke signs without imperial approval, triggering fury among loyalist samurai. In March of 1860, Ji is assassinated outside the Sakurada Gate of Edo Castle by swordsmen from Mito Domain, a killing that announces the era of political violence. The cry of Sonojoy, "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians," becomes the rallying ideology of disaffected domains, particularly Choshu in the west and Satsuma in the south. Choshu batteries fire on foreign ships passing through the Straits of Shimonoseki in 1863. A combined Western fleet retaliates the following year, demolishing the fortifications in hours. Satsuma learns the same lesson when British warships bombard Kagoshima in 1863 after the killing of a British merchant. The message is identical in both cases. Conventional resistance against industrial military power is suicidal. This realization transforms the movement. The most perceptive leaders in Satsuma and Choshu abandon the fantasy of expulsion and embrace the radical alternative: overthrow the shogunate, restore imperial authority, and modernize Japan rapidly enough to resist Western domination on Western terms. A secret alliance between these 2 historically rival domains, brokered in 1866, creates the political and military force capable of toppling Tokugawa rule. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, formally returns governing authority to the emperor in November of 1867, hoping to preserve Tokugawa influence within a new political arrangement. He miscalculates. On the 3rd of January, 1868, forces loyal to Satsuma and Choshu seize the imperial palace in Kyoto and proclaim the restoration of direct imperial rule under the young Emperor Meiji, barely 15 years old. The Boshin War that follows sweeps Tokugawa resistance northward through the spring and summer, ending with the surrender of the last holdouts at Hakodate in June of 1869. 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa governance dissolve in 18 months of political maneuvering and brief but decisive combat. The black ships had not merely opened ports, they had cracked open an entire political order, and from within it something unprecedented is already emerging. What emerges is not reform, but revolution conducted with the discipline of bureaucracy. Within months of the restoration, the new government relocates the emperor from Kyoto to Edo, renaming the city Tokyo, the eastern capital. The young sovereign, still a teenager, becomes the living symbol of a transformation, orchestrated by a remarkably small circle of men, most of them former samurai from Satsuma, Choshu, Tosa, and Hizen, the very domains that toppled the Tokugawa. They move with astonishing speed. In 1869, the daimyo of these 4 leading domains voluntarily return their land registers to the emperor under the policy known as Hanseki Hokan, and other lords follow under mounting pressure. 2 years later, the government abolishes the domains entirely, replacing them with prefectures administered by centrally appointed governors. In a single decree, 300 years of feudal territorial sovereignty vanish. The architects of this new order understand that transformation requires knowledge. In 1871, the Iwakura mission departs Yokohama, nearly 50 senior officials and more than 40 students, sailing first to San Francisco, then across the United States, through Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and beyond. For 18 months they inspect factories, parliaments, shipyards, schools, and armies. They return not with a single model, but with a composite vision, selecting what suits Japan from each nation encountered. The Prussian military system impresses them. British naval power commands respect. French legal codes offer structure. American industrial energy inspires urgency. At home, the changes multiply. In 1872, a steam locomotive runs between Tokyo and Yokohama along 18 miles of British-engineered track. That same year, a national education system mandates schooling for all children. In 1873, the government replaces feudal rice taxes with a modern land tax payable in cash, creating a predictable revenue stream that funds industrialization. A conscription ordinance the same year builds a national army drawn from all classes, shattering the samurai monopoly on military service. Former warriors lose their stipends, then their right to carry swords under the Sword Abolishment Edict of 1876. Not all accept this erasure quietly. In 1877, Saigo Takamori, once among the most powerful architects of the Restoration, leads disaffected samurai from Satsuma in open rebellion. For 7 months, his forces fight the new conscript army across Kyushu. The siege of Kumamoto Castle and the battles that follow prove decisive. The conscripts, peasant-born and rifle-trained, defeat the sword-carrying warriors of an older world. Saigo dies on the slopes of Shiroyama in September. His rebellion is the last armed resistance of the samurai class, and its failure confirms that the feudal order is truly finished. Through the 1880s, the transformation deepens. Okubo Toshimichi, the cold strategist who shaped early Meiji policy before his assassination in 1878, gives way to Ito Hirobumi as the dominant figure. Ito spends months in Europe studying constitutional systems and returns convinced that a Prussian-style framework best suits Japan. A strong executive under a sovereign emperor with a legislature that channels public voice without surrendering imperial authority. On the 11th of February, 1889, Emperor Meiji promulgates the constitution as a gift from the throne to the people. It establishes a bicameral imperial diet, an independent judiciary, and guaranteed rights, though carefully circumscribed. The following year, the first parliamentary elections take place. Japan has traveled from feudal fragmentation to constitutional monarchy in barely 2 decades, a velocity of institutional change without parallel in the 19th century. The nation that foreign powers had dismissed now possesses a modern army, a growing industrial base, a literate population, a railway network, and a written constitution. And it is only beginning. The constitution is barely 5 years old when Japan tests its new machinery of state against the crumbling Qing Empire. The dispute centers on Korea, a peninsula both powers regard as vital to their strategic interests. When a Korean peasant uprising in 1894 draws Chinese troops across the border, Japan dispatches its own forces, and by August the two nations are at war. The conflict reveals what the Meiji reforms have actually produced. Japanese divisions, trained on Prussian models, equipped with modern rifles and disciplined logistics, overwhelm Chinese forces at Pyongyang in September and drive them northward. At the Yalu River, the Imperial Japanese Navy, built in British shipyards and commanded by officers educated in Western naval academies, engages the Beiyang fleet and inflicts devastating losses. By early 1895, Japanese troops have seized Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula and the fortified naval base at Weihaiwei. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed in April, grants Japan Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, the Liaodong Peninsula, and a massive indemnity. China recognizes Korean independence from its own suzerainty, effectively delivering the peninsula into Japan's sphere of influence. The victory electrifies the nation and alarms the Western powers. Within a week, Russia, France, and Germany issue the Triple Intervention, forcing Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China. The humiliation burns deeply into the national consciousness and redirects Japanese strategic planning toward an inevitable confrontation with Russia. The indemnity funds pour into military expansion. Warship orders multiply. Army divisions grow. The slogan of the decade becomes perseverance through hardship. In 1902, Japan secures the Anglo-Japanese alliance, the first military pact between a Western and a non-Western power, guaranteeing British neutrality or support should Japan face more than one enemy. The alliance transforms Japan's diplomatic position overnight. When negotiations with Russia over Manchuria and Korea collapse, Japan strikes on the 8th of February, 1904, launching a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. The Russo-Japanese War that follows astonishes the world. Japanese armies besiege Port Arthur for 5 brutal months, losing tens of thousands in frontal assaults against entrenched positions before the fortress falls in January 1905. At Mukden in March, 300,000 Japanese soldiers engage Russian forces in one of the largest land battles fought before the First World War. The decisive blow falls at sea. Admiral Togo Heihachiro, waiting in the Tsushima Strait on the 27th of May, 1905, intercepts the Russian Baltic Fleet after its exhausting 7-month voyage around Africa and across the Indian Ocean. In a single afternoon, Japanese gunnery destroys or captures virtually the entire fleet. The Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by the American president, grants Japan the southern half of Sakhalin, Russian railway and mining rights in southern Manchuria, and recognition of paramount interests in Korea. Japan has defeated a European great power, the first non-Western nation to do so in modern history. The consequences ripple outward. Across Asia, colonized peoples take note. Within Japan, the treaty's lack of a financial indemnity provokes riots in Tokyo, revealing a public appetite for imperial gain that will prove difficult to restrain. Korea becomes a Japanese protectorate in 1905, and full annexation follows in 1910, beginning a colonial occupation that will last 35 years and leave wounds still unhealed a century later. Factories in Osaka and Kobe expand relentlessly, producing steel, textiles, and armaments. Railways penetrate Manchuria. A merchant marine grows to rival European fleets. On the 30th of July, 1912, Emperor Meiji dies. His reign has witnessed the most extraordinary transformation any modern nation has undergone, from feudal isolation to constitutional empire, from wooden warships to dreadnoughts, from a country forced open at gunpoint to one that dictates terms to ancient empires. His funeral procession moves through Tokyo in silence, and on the night of the ceremony, General Nogi Maresuke, the hero of Port Arthur, takes his own life in ritual suicide, following his sovereign into death. The gesture belongs to an older world, yet the empire Meiji leaves behind is hurtling toward a future whose dangers are already gathering beneath the surface of triumph. The new emperor, Yoshihito, ascends the chrysanthemum throne in 1912, and almost immediately the texture of Japanese public life begins to shift. Where Meiji had embodied iron discipline and national purpose, the Taisho era opens with something unfamiliar, a loosening, a sense that the people themselves might claim a voice in the state their fathers built. The catalyst arrives in 1913 when Prime Minister Katsura Taro attempts to govern without parliamentary support and crowds surge through Tokyo streets demanding constitutional government. Katsura falls within weeks. The message is unmistakable. Cabinets must now answer to elected parties, not merely to imperial advisors whispering behind palace screens. The First World War accelerates everything. Japan, allied with Britain, seizes German possessions in Shandong and the Pacific Islands, and Japanese factories boom, supplying the Allies with munitions and textiles. Shipyards work through the night. Fortunes multiply. But the wealth distributes unevenly, and when rice prices spike catastrophically in the summer of 1918, fury erupts. The rice riots begin in a fishing village in Toyama Prefecture, where women march against grain merchants, and within weeks the unrest engulfs cities across the archipelago. Troops are deployed in over 100 locations. The crisis brings down the government and installs Hara Takashi, the first commoner to serve as prime minister, leading a true party cabinet. Democracy, it seems, is taking root. Tokyo in the early 20s pulses with modernity. Department stores rise along the Ginza, their glass facades reflecting streetcars and automobiles. Jazz drifts from basement cafes, where young women in bobbed hair and Western dresses, the modern girls, sip coffee beside students debating Marx and Kropotkin. Labor unions organize textile workers. Magazines multiply. The literary world produces voices of startling originality. Then the earth moves. At 2 minutes before noon on the 1st of September, 1923, a magnitude 7.9 earthquake strikes the Kanto Plain. Tokyo and Yokohama collapse into rubble and flame. Firestorms sweep through wooden neighborhoods, incinerating tens of thousands in open spaces where they have gathered for safety. Over 100,000 people perish. In the chaos, vigilante mobs murder thousands of Korean residents, driven by baseless rumors of sabotage. The disaster exposes both the fragility of the modern city and the darkness lurking beneath its cosmopolitan surface. Reconstruction proceeds with astonishing speed, and by the mid-20s, Tokyo rises again in reinforced concrete and wider boulevards. In 1925, the Diet passes universal male suffrage, granting the vote to all men over 25, regardless of tax status, tripling the electorate overnight. Yet on the very same day, the Peace Preservation Law passes alongside it, criminalizing any movement that threatens the Kokutai, the national polity centered on the emperor. Democracy and repression advance hand in hand. Emperor Yoshihito, long debilitated by neurological illness, gives way to his son Hirohito, who becomes regent in 1921 and formally ascends as the Showa emperor in 1926. The young sovereign inherits a nation of contradictions, parliamentary politics coexisting with an army that answers constitutionally to the throne alone, not to elected ministers. Junior officers steeped in ultranationalist ideology begin to see civilian politicians as corrupt obstacles to Japan's imperial destiny. When the global depression strikes in 1929, it devastates the countryside with particular cruelty. Silk prices collapse, and farming families who depend on sericulture to supplement rice income face starvation. Daughters are sold into urban labor. Villages that once sent their sons proudly into the conscript army now send them seething with resentment against Tokyo's bankers and party bosses. Military recruiters find willing ears. Secret societies proliferate in garrison towns, and young officers draft plans not for foreign conquest alone, but for the purification of Japan itself. By 1931, the fragile architecture of Taisho democracy stands exposed to forces it cannot contain, an army that has learned to act without orders, an economy in crisis, and a nationalism that regards parliamentary compromise as betrayal. On the night of September 18, 1931, a small quantity of dynamite detonates beside the South Manchuria railway track near Mukden. The damage is so slight that a train passes over the spot minutes later without incident. Yet this manufactured pretext, staged by officers of the Kwantung Army without authorization from Tokyo, unleashes a cascade that will consume millions of lives. Within hours, Japanese troops pour into Mukden. Within days, they sweep across southern Manchuria. The civilian government in Tokyo, stunned and divided, issues orders to halt the advance. The army ignores them. By early 1932, the entirety of Manchuria falls under Japanese military control, and a puppet state called Manchukuo is proclaimed with the last Qing emperor, Puyi, installed as a figurehead. When the League of Nations condemns the seizure, Japan simply withdraws from the organization in 1933, stepping beyond the framework of international order with a finality that shocks Western capitals. The pattern is now set, the military acts, and civilians accommodate. Assassination becomes a political instrument. Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi is shot dead by young naval officers in May 1932. Moderate politicians, industrialists, and intellectuals learn to speak carefully or not at all. Then, on February 26, 1936, over 1,400 troops from the 1st Division seize central Tokyo, murder several senior statesmen, and demand a military government purged of liberal influence. The rebellion fails within 3 days, its leaders executed. Yet the paradox is devastating. The suppression of the coup strengthens precisely the institutional military authority the rebels sought to empower. Civilian cabinets henceforth govern only at the army's sufferance. Prince Konoe Fumimaro becomes prime minister in June 1937, a cultured aristocrat who believes he can manage the generals. Within weeks, a skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing on July 7th escalates into full-scale war with China. Japanese forces capture Shanghai after brutal urban combat, then advance on the nationalist capital of Nanjing. What follows in December 1937 is a catastrophe of mass atrocity, weeks of killing, assault, and destruction that claim tens of thousands of Chinese civilian and prisoner lives in what becomes known as the Nanjing Massacre. The war, never formally declared, devours resources and manpower without producing the swift victory Tokyo expects. Chiang Kai-shek retreats inland to Chongqing, and the conflict becomes a grinding occupation across a vast and hostile landscape. At home, the National Mobilization Law of 1938 places the entire economy on a war footing. School children drill with wooden rifles. Neighborhood associations monitor loyalty. Rice, cotton, and metal are rationed. The press prints only what the military permits. Japan signs the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in September 1940, binding itself to an alliance that alarms Washington and London. When Japanese forces occupy northern French Indochina that same month, and southern Indochina in July 1941, the United States responds with a devastating oil embargo. Japan imports over 80% of its petroleum from American sources. The embargo is an economic ultimatum. General Tojo Hideki becomes prime minister in October 1941. Diplomatic negotiations with Washington stall over irreconcilable demands. America insists on withdrawal from China, which the military regards as unthinkable after years of sacrifice. The decision crystallizes in imperial conference rooms where maps of the Pacific spread across lacquered tables. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, carrier-launched aircraft descend upon Pearl Harbor, and Japan plunges into a war against the greatest industrial power on Earth. A gamble born not of confidence, but of desperation, staked on the hope that a shattered American fleet will force a negotiated peace before the full weight of that industrial might can be brought to bear. The gamble fails almost immediately. In the opening months, Japanese forces sweep across Southeast Asia with stunning speed. Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, the Philippines, seizing oil fields, rubber plantations, and strategic harbors in a vast arc stretching from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the empire controls a territory larger than any Asian power has ever held. Zero fighters dominate the skies. The British fortress of Singapore falls in February, its garrison of 80,000 surrendering to a force half its size. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the vision of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere appears within reach. But the war's logic turns at midway. On the 4th of June, 1942, American dive bombers catch 4 Japanese fleet carriers with their flight decks loaded with rearming aircraft. Within 5 minutes, 3 carriers are ablaze. The 4th follows hours later. In a single morning, Japan loses the offensive striking power that made its Pacific conquests possible. The war becomes one of attrition, precisely the kind of conflict the planners in Tokyo had desperately hoped to avoid. Guadalcanal becomes the grinding proof. From August 1942 through February 1943, Japanese and American forces fight over a jungle airstrip in the Solomon Islands. Starvation kills as many Japanese soldiers as combat. Supply lines stretch thin across vast ocean distances that American submarines increasingly dominate. The island-hopping campaign that follows is methodical and merciless. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, each assault bringing American bombers closer to the Japanese home islands. When Saipan falls in July 1944, civilians leap from cliffs rather than face capture, and the loss triggers the fall of the Tojo government. General MacArthur returns to the Philippines in October 1944. At Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Navy commits virtually its entire remaining fleet and loses it. Kamikaze attacks begin in earnest. Young pilots, some barely 20 years old, writing final letters to their mothers before diving their aircraft into American warships. The tactic inflicts terrible damage, but cannot reverse the strategic reality. The bombing of the home islands begins in earnest under General Curtis LeMay. On the night of March 10, 1945, 334 bombers drop incendiary clusters over eastern Tokyo. The firestorm consumes 16 square miles of densely packed wooden neighborhoods. Over 100,000 civilians perish in a single night, more than in any other single air raid in history. City after city follows: Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, until 67 urban centers lie in ruins, and millions of refugees crowd the countryside. Iwo Jima falls in March after 5 weeks of subterranean combat. Okinawa, invaded on the 1st of April, becomes the war's bloodiest Pacific battle. Over 12,000 Americans, 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and perhaps 100,000 Okinawan civilians dead by June. The invasion of the home islands looms, with projected casualties on both sides reaching into the millions. On the 6th of August, 1945, a single bomb falls on Hiroshima. The fireball reaches temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Approximately 80,000 people die instantly. Tens of thousands more follow from radiation. 3 days later, a second bomb destroys Nagasaki. Between these two detonations, the Soviet Union declares war and invades Manchuria, shattering the last faint hope of a negotiated peace through Moscow. On the 15th of August, a voice never before heard by ordinary Japanese, the Emperor's own, thin and formal through radio static, announces that the nation must endure the unendurable. Families kneel before wooden radio sets, weeping. Approximately 3 million Japanese have died. A third of the national wealth has been destroyed, and every major city save Kyoto lies in ashes. The empire that stretched from the Aleutians to Burma has collapsed in 3 years and 8 months, consumed by the very industrial fire its architects had wagered they could outrun. Into this silence of ash and surrender steps a single figure who will reshape Japan more profoundly than any foreign conqueror in its history. General Douglas MacArthur arrives in late August 1945, descending from his aircraft at Atsugi Airfield unarmed, pipe clenched between his teeth, projecting a confidence that borders on theater. Within weeks, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers establishes his headquarters in the Dai-Ichi Insurance Building across from the Imperial Palace, and from this office he governs a nation of 70 million with fewer than 5,000 American administrative personnel. The occupation moves with astonishing speed. In October, MacArthur issues directives guaranteeing civil liberties, releasing political prisoners, and legalizing labor unions. Women receive the right to vote. The great Zaibatsu conglomerates, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Yasuda, are ordered dissolved, their concentrated economic power deemed inseparable from the militarism that produced the war. A sweeping land reform transfers ownership from absentee landlords to the tenant farmers who actually work the soil, transforming rural Japan almost overnight. By 1950, nearly 90% of arable land belongs to those who cultivate it. The centerpiece of the occupation is the new constitution, drafted largely by MacArthur's staff in a single week during February 1946, and promulgated the following November. Article 9 renounces war as a sovereign right and prohibits the maintenance of military forces, a clause without precedent in modern statecraft. The emperor remains, but as a symbol stripped of political authority. Sovereignty now rests for the first time in Japanese history with the people. Yet the geopolitical landscape shifts beneath these reforms. The communist victory in China in 1949 and the outbreak of war on the Korean peninsula in June 1950 transformed Japan from a defeated enemy into an indispensable ally. American military procurement orders flood Japanese factories. Steel mills, textile plants, and vehicle manufacturers that had stood idle roar back to life, producing trucks, uniforms, and ammunition for United Nations forces fighting across the strait. The Korean War boom injects billions of dollars into the Japanese economy and lays the industrial foundation for everything that follows. In September 1951, the San Francisco Peace Treaty restores Japanese sovereignty, and alongside it, the United States-Japan Security Treaty binds the two nations in a military alliance that allows American bases to remain on Japanese soil. Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru's doctrine crystallizes: shelter under the American security umbrella, minimize defense spending, and channel every available resource into economic reconstruction. It is a bargain that will define Japanese grand strategy for generations. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry orchestrates what amounts to a guided capitalism. It directs capital towards strategic industries, protects infant manufacturers from foreign competition, and encourages the formation of keiretsu, interlocking corporate networks that replace the dissolved zaibatsu with structures nearly as powerful but more diffuse. Toyota refines production methods that will revolutionize global manufacturing. Sony introduces the transistor radio. Shipyards along the inland sea launch vessels at a pace that soon makes Japan the world's largest shipbuilder. In 1960, Prime Minister Ikeda Hayato announces an income doubling plan, promising to double the gross national product within a decade. The target is met in 7 years. Growth averages 10% annually, an expansion so sustained it earns the name economic miracle. Rice paddies give way to factory complexes. Villages empty as young workers migrate to Osaka, Nagoya, and Tokyo, filling apartment blocks of poured concrete that rise where fire-bombed neighborhoods once smoldered. On the 1st of October 1964, the Shinkansen bullet train departs Tokyo for Osaka, covering the distance in 4 hours at speeds no passenger railway has ever achieved. 9 days later, Emperor Hirohito opens the 18th Olympic Games in a stadium built on the grounds where occupation troops once drilled. Athletes from 93 nations march beneath autumn sunlight, and television cameras broadcast the spectacle worldwide. The nation that lay in ashes 19 years earlier now presents itself as modern, prosperous, and peaceful. Reborn not through conquest, but through the disciplined reinvention that has defined its civilization across millennia. The factories never stop. Through the late 1960s, Japanese assembly lines hum around the clock, turning raw steel and imported oil into automobiles, televisions, cameras, and transistor radios that flood markets across North America and Western Europe. Toyota refines its production system, eliminating waste, empowering workers to halt the line at the first sign of defect, until Japanese manufacturing becomes synonymous with precision. Sony miniaturizes the world, shipping portable televisions and tape recorders from plants in Shinagawa. Honda, once a maker of motorcycle engines in a wooden shed, begins exporting compact cars that American consumers discover are reliable, fuel-efficient, and astonishingly affordable. By 1968, Japan overtakes West Germany to become the world's second-largest economy. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry orchestrates industrial policy with a subtlety no Western bureaucracy can match, steering capital toward shipbuilding, then steel, then electronics, then automobiles, each sector ascending in sequence like terraces cut into a mountainside. Keiretsu networks, interlocking corporate groups anchored by major banks, provide patient long-term financing that rewards growth over quarterly profit. Salarymen in dark suits pack commuter trains from suburban bedroom towns into the glass towers of Marunouchi and Shinjuku, working hours that stretch deep into evening, their loyalty to the company absolute. Then the oil shock of 1973 strikes like a blade. Arab petroleum exporters quadruple prices overnight, and Japan, importing nearly all its energy, staggers. Inflation spikes, toilet paper vanishes from store shelves, and growth rates plummet. Yet the crisis accelerates transformation. Japanese industry pivots toward energy efficiency and high technology with extraordinary speed. Automobile engines shrink and sip fuel. Semiconductor fabrication plants multiply across Kyushu, earning the island the nickname Silicon Island. By the early 1980s, Japanese memory chips dominate global markets, and the Walkman portable cassette player, introduced in 1979, becomes the defining consumer object of its decade. The Plaza Accord of 1985, signed among 5 major economies, deliberately weakens the American dollar against the yen. The Bank of Japan responds by slashing interest rates to stimulate domestic demand, and cheap money pours into real estate and equities. Tokyo land prices soar until the grounds of the Imperial Palace are said to be worth more than all the real estate in California. The Nikkei stock index climbs relentlessly, reaching 38,957 on the final trading day of 1989. Corporate executives purchase impressionist paintings, Hawaiian golf courses, and Rockefeller Center. Neon-drenched Ginza glitters with conspicuous wealth. The reckoning arrives swiftly. In early 1990, the Nikkei begins its collapse, losing nearly half its value within a year. Property prices follow, falling for more than a decade. Banks discover their loan portfolios are anchored to assets now worth a fraction of their paper value, Zombie companies, insolvent but kept alive by reluctant lenders, clog the economy. Growth stalls. The phrase lost decade enters the national vocabulary. Nature and terror compound the malaise. On January 17, 1995, a magnitude 6.9 earthquake devastates Kobe, killing over 6,000 people and exposing the inadequacy of disaster response. 2 months later, members of the Aum Shinrikyo cult release sarin nerve gas on Tokyo subway trains during morning rush hour, killing 13 and injuring thousands. The twin shocks shatter assumptions about safety that had underpinned post-war confidence. Political change follows economic stagnation. In 1993, the Liberal Democratic Party loses power for the first time in 38 years, when a coalition led by Hosokawa Morihiro briefly governs. Electoral reform reshapes the system, yet no leader finds a formula to restore dynamism. As the century closes, Japan remains wealthy, technologically advanced, and culturally influential, yet haunted by deflation, aging demographics, and the memory of a bubble whose burst revealed that even the most disciplined economies are not immune to the ancient human temptation of believing that prices never fall. The new millennium opens, and Japan is still the world's second-largest economy, yet the vital signs tell a different story. Birth rates have fallen below replacement level since the early 1970s, and by 2005, the population peaks at roughly 127 million before beginning an unprecedented decline. Rural villages empty, schools close. Entire towns in the mountainous interior lose their youngest generation to Tokyo and Osaka, leaving behind communities where the elderly outnumber children 10 to 1. Robots staff hotel desks and nursing facilities, not as novelty, but as necessity. The demographic arithmetic is unforgiving. Projections suggest the population will fall below 100 million before 2050. Politically, the early 2000s bring a brief jolt of energy when Koizumi Junichiro becomes prime minister in 2001, privatizing the postal savings system and dispatching self-defense forces to support reconstruction in Iraq. Yet deflation persists, wages stagnate, and a revolving door of short-lived cabinets follows his departure. In 2010, China overtakes Japan as the world's second-largest economy, a symbolic shift that reverberates through national consciousness. Then the Earth moves. At 2:46 in the afternoon on March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9 earthquake strikes off the Pacific coast of Tohoku. The resulting tsunami, reaching heights above 40 meters in places, obliterates coastal towns within minutes. Nearly 20,000 people perish. At the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, cooling systems fail, triggering triple meltdowns and the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. Evacuation zones empty entire municipalities. The triple catastrophe forces Japan to shut down its nuclear fleet and confront fundamental questions about energy, resilience, and the contract between government and citizen. Recovery is slow, methodical, and revealing. Communities rebuild seawalls higher than any before. Temporary housing shelters tens of thousands for years. The disaster accelerates debates already simmering about national preparedness, constitutional authority, and Japan's place in an increasingly volatile Asia-Pacific. Abe Shinzo returns to the premiership in December 2012, launching an ambitious economic program dubbed Abenomics: monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, structural reform. He pushes security legislation through the Diet in 2015, reinterpreting Article 9 to permit collective self-defense for the first time. The move provokes massive street protests, yet reflects a broader anxiety about Chinese maritime expansion in the East China Sea and North Korean missile launches arcing over Japanese territory. Abe becomes the longest-serving prime minister in Japanese history before resigning for health reasons in 2020. His assassination in Nara in July 2022 stuns the nation and exposes unexpected ties between political figures and religious organizations. Through all of this, Japan's cultural reach only deepens. Anime and manga generate billions in global revenue. Japanese cuisine earns recognition from international culinary bodies. Technology firms pioneer robotics, semiconductor materials, and precision manufacturing that underpin global supply chains. Kyoto's temples welcome tens of millions of visitors annually, while Shibuya's neon crossing pulses as an icon of hypermodernity. Yet the tension endures. A civilization shaped by volcanic islands, typhoon seasons, and centuries of deliberate reinvention now faces challenges no previous generation imagined. A population that shrinks by several 100,000 each year, energy dependence that geopolitics can exploit, and a constitution written under foreign occupation whose pacifist article remains both cherished and contested. Japan does not collapse under these pressures. It adapts, as it has adapted before, absorbing continental culture in the 7th century, reinventing governance under the Meiji reformers, rebuilding from atomic ruin in the 20th. The archipelago endures not because it resists change, but because it has mastered the art of transforming itself while preserving something essential beneath the surface, a continuity of craft, ritual, landscape, and collective memory that stretches back to the cord-marked pottery of the Jomon and forward into whatever century comes next. Thank you for joining this journey through the complete story of Japan. If these episodes have deepened your understanding, consider subscribing so you never miss a new documentary when it arrives.